Hi, my name is Alexis, and I'm going to be talking about the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story by Miss Adichie. She starts out her TED Talk by saying that she's a storyteller. She grew up in Africa and loved to read and write. All of the stories that she would read and write about were about white people who had blue eyes and blonde hair and sat under big trees eating apples talking about how lovely the weather was. Obviously, this was nothing like her current situation at the time. She didn't know that people like her could exist in literature. This shows how impressionable we are in front of a story. Obviously, when she got older, she learned that there are tons of stories about people like her. When she moved to America to go to school, everyone pitied her because she was African. This was because they only had one story of Africa. They assumed that since she was from Africa, she wasn't educated or she grew up in a really poor community, but this obviously was not the case. She says that if we don't actually try to see the entire truth, we only get one story. Of course, she too, like all of us, have been one of the people who sees only one story of a certain thing. And this occurs all the time in current day. She says that if you show people as only one thing, that is what they become. She also says that it's really important to understand that one person or their ideals or their actions does not represent that entire group of people. This is a really important thing to remember because so often we're quick to judge just after seeing the single story of a group of people. She also says that the single story creates stereotypes and that these stereotypes are not necessarily wrong, they're just incomplete. If you don't show the entire truth about something, obviously you can't get the complete story. She then concluded her talk by saying that when we reject the single story, we regain a kind of paradise. I think this talk is really important and very relevant to today because so often people are too quick to judge an entire group of people just because of what they see or hear on media or the news. A good example of this is from the TED Talk, What Do You Think When You See Me? By Dalia Mogahed. She's Muslim, and she talks about how after 9/11, a lot of people assumed that just because she's Muslim, she's a terrorist. And therefore, she was worried that those people might hurt her, and she didn't leave her house for a few days. Now, these people that thought that she was a terrorist just because she's Muslim were only seeing the single story. They were seeing what was on the news and thinking that because ISIS is a terrorist group and does terrible things, all Muslims must be like that. And obviously this is not true. And it's really important to make sure that we're seeing the entire story instead of just the single one, because if we only see the single story, then we will judge people that do not deserve to be judged. Dalia Mogahed obviously did not deserve to be called a terrorist just because she's Muslim, and there are so many stories like this. Another example of this is Miss Adichie, who wrote The Danger of a Single Story TED Talk. She did not deserve to be pitied when she came to America for school, just because she was from Africa. People thought that because she was from Africa, she was poor or she wasn't educated when she was younger, and that's just not true. The single story really affects so many different groups of people, of races and ethnicities and religions, and Miss Adichie really gave a great TED Talk about how important it is to focus on seeing the entire story of each group of people before we go to have an opinion or judge them. Seeing the entire story is also really important because if we focus on trying to see the entire story of each group of people, it will allow us to understand that people who we might view as very different from us are actually very similar, and it will allow us to communicate and get along better with all different types of people. The TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, teaches us that we need to learn the entire truth and the entire story before we go to make assessments or judgments about any group of people.